Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Our panelists this morning come from a variety of disciplines and will each use their unique experiences and perspectives to give us a panoramic view of the state of the liberal arts as they see it. Erika King is professor of political science at Grand Valley State University, where she has served as chair of the Department of Political Science and dean of social sciences. Previously, King was professor of political science and associate dean of the faculty at Chatham University. Her teaching and research specialization is mass media and politics, and she has published in a variety of scholarly journals. Her most recent book, Obama, The Media and Framing the U.S. Exit from Iraq and Afghanistan, was published earlier this year. Judy Whipps is professor of liberal studies and philosophy at Grand Valley. She earned her PhD in philosophy at Union Institute with a dissertation on philosophy and social activism, an exploration of pragmatism and activism, of Jane Addams, John Dewey, and engaged Buddhism. Dr. Whipps also holds an MA from the University of Chicago Divinity School and a BA from the Liberal Studies program at GVSU. Her main interests are American philosophy, particularly the intersection of feminism and pragmatism, as well as philosophy of education. Quincy Williams is the undergraduate and internship coordinator for the School of Public, Nonprofit, and Health Administration at Grand Valley. He earned his BA in Human Service Agency Management and Recreation Administration from Missouri Valley College and his MA from Lindenwood University. Before coming to Grand Valley, Williams served as the National Director of Internships and Placement Programs for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance Incorporated. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning. I'm serving as the moderator for this panel, so my first question as moderator is, can you hear me properly? No. Okay, we were told, I think now to follow instructions properly, we were told not to stand up. But as good free-thinking academics, we decided we all preferred to talk standing up. But now we know why we've been told not to stand up. So we will force ourselves to remain in a seated position, but please understand what we would like to be doing is wandering around a little bit and having more of a sense of interaction with the audience. But technology has its limitations, and therefore we are going to sit behind this semi-curtain here. What I would like to do is just first, as the moderator, introduce the fact that what we're going to be discussing for an hour and a half or so is similar in one way to what the previous keynote speakers have talked about, and that is the issue of politicization in the academy, the whole question about ideology and its potential or actual impacts on the academy. But what we're going to do, the three of us, is shift gears slightly and look at these kinds of questions from the perspective of faculty. We've all had backgrounds as administrators as well, but what we're going to be looking at is sort of from the perspective of being in the trenches at Grand Valley State University. What is happening at this particular institution, and what does it say about our disciplines? And the wonderful research that both of our previous speakers last night and this morning presented gives us an idea about the fact that there are ideological biases out there in the academy as well as in this whole world of the institutions outside of the academy. But what is the impact then, this morning, we're going to be discussing on what goes on in the classroom and also in terms of advising and working with different kinds of students. One of the things, though, that I must first say is that as a political scientist, I am extremely grateful to Matt Wesner for doing such a lovely job of proselytizing for the field of political science. So if one thinks about whether faculty indeed proselytize a certain point of view, I think that Professor Wesner has done a marvelous idea of proselytizing for my particular discipline. So if I seem to have a glow at the moment, it is because of the fabulous things that he has said. So I shall try as a political scientist to live up to all of that wonderful advance hype. One of the things, though, that I want to think about, or have us all think about from the perspective of political science, is something that a couple of the audience members raised in the question and answer session just a few moments ago. And that's the nature of how we conceptualize, how we define ideology. And I think that's an important thing to think about, because what we're concerned with in this particular conference is whether there is some sort of bias that is a problem for the academic world. So we need, I think, to take a little bit of a step back and think about what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about ideology. And as I say, a couple of the questioners, I think, very nicely began to get at one of the issues that I think is important to raise, and that is that the question of ideology, ideological bias, politicization, I think is often framed or studied in an overly simplistic manner. And that is to try to divide everything into the world of liberal and conservatism, as if there is, and I see a nodding head there, so thank you for that point, as if there is a tidy continuum that just separates the two. I think of this much more as a nuanced phenomenon. And it's so nuanced that I think to be ideal about it, we should be discussing this as a worldwide phenomenon, looking at other societies and other cultures. But please bear with me, because I think what we need to do this morning is just look at it within the U.S. Academy. But part of what I need to have us think about is something that I think is so beautifully illustrated for a political scientist by just a couple of recent events in the past week. And the one that is sort of roiling my field of political science is the electoral defeat of Erika Cantor in Virginia just a couple of evenings ago in the Republican primary. What I think this illustrates very, very nicely is the complexity and the nuance that we need to think about if we're just looking at it even solely from the perspective of the political dimension of conservatism. It isn't one nice and tidy slot. What we saw played out the other day, and what I think we'll continue to see played out over the months and probably years to come, is the fact that contemporary conservatism is not one unified or unitary phenomenon, nor is contemporary liberalism. So when you talk about the academy as being one thing and not another, I think perhaps that is too simplistic. And I think the previous speakers also addressed this, but then found the difficulty of trying to do empirical research. And so what I'm not doing here, and I don't think my colleagues are either, is reporting on specific research projects, but on how you approach this much more complicated and nuanced phenomenon within the classroom. But as I say, I'm just trying at the moment to set the stage here. If we look at ideology in contemporary America, it's certainly something that political scientists have to be concerned with, because the way in which we define ideology is to think about basic worldviews, the assumptions that we make about society and the political world, our beliefs about what is going on in contemporary America. And then I think in terms of ideology, joining those basic beliefs is the notion of what ought to be. So not just what is, but what is the ideal, and whether there's a gap between these two things. And so just as an example, again, the election from the night before last, what we see within the conservative phenomenon right now is a debate going on a number of different dimensions. But one of the ones that I think is very interesting, that didn't actually play out the other night, but I think is another interesting division, political surveillance and national security. Is that a conservative or a liberal phenomenon? To be concerned about this, to be worried about it. What we find is that on both sides of the political spectrum, there are deep divisions going on and debates within the United States. Should we surveil? Should we not surveil? What is the issue of privacy? And we find, for example, that there are a number of conservatives who are as concerned about this as are deep-seated liberals, both concerned about the issue of privacy. So that when we think about liberal versus conservative faculty, we don't all just divide neatly and tidily as conservative faculty say this, liberal faculty say that. There just is a lot more nuance and a lot more subtlety here. Turning then from the more generic concept of what we mean by ideology to thinking about it in the classroom, one of the things that I try always to do is and this again is my own value bias because I come, like all other people in my classrooms, to the classroom with my own set of basic beliefs, but also my own set of ideals about what I would like the good society to be. My own practice, however, is not to share those basic ideals and beliefs with my students. I see my role as trying to get them to firm up their own ideas. I'm not in the business of changing people's minds. I'm not in the business of trying to instill my beliefs on other people. But what I am in the business of doing is creating more knowledge and awareness. And I think this is something that my colleagues are going to address as well. To expand people's horizons, to give them perspectives they may not have had before. And I'm not asking them to accept my assumptions, but I am asking them to carefully consider, to think about, to reflect upon their own beliefs and values. To be able, because political science has become more and more, as my colleagues who are giving the keynote addresses talked about earlier, has become more of an empirically driven discipline. We look for evidence. We try to uncover the best evidence possible. I try to talk to students about if you have beliefs and values, and I do not then talk about denigrating or applauding them. I just say if you have beliefs and values, think very carefully about the evidence that you have mustered for your perceptions and the values that you're trying to impart. How do we collect that evidence? How do we then assess and evaluate that evidence? And then also very importantly, and here the issue of ideology does come into play, how do we interpret that particular kinds of evidence? And I think this is very, very important as in the trenches, in the classroom, in the world of liberal arts. Having students learn how to think and what are the kinds of questions we ought to be asking and the kinds of answers, not necessarily one being right and one being wrong, but how to arrive at trying to understand and draw conclusions based on that evidence, based on that material. And I think if I can say over the decades, indeed many decades that I've been teaching, I try to think maybe this is one of the things that I have been successful in doing, teaching students or helping students learn how to think, how to evaluate. And then I hope to take that information out and not just have knee-jerk reactions to the moment. Going back to what I said at the beginning about the election the other night, one of the things that the media tends to do, because it's part of their job description, is to jump to immediate conclusions. And what I saw in the media analyses of why Cantor lost the other night were a whole bunch of explanations that might or might not be valid, accurate kinds of explanations. The media people had to come up with those explanations as their job description within nanoseconds of the information coming out. It's our job as academics to reflect upon the event, to try to explain it, to gather the appropriate information. And if that's what we can do as instructors, I really think that we have done our job. So in conclusion, I would say it's just my personal perspective. I am not trying to impose a uniform way of coming up with beliefs or answers, but to expose people to the possibilities and to get them, being my students, to think about what is out there and whether you agree or disagree. One last example, I teach political campaigns. I get students who are ardent Republicans as well as ardent Democrats in the class, but what they can both end up doing at the end of my course on political campaigns is provide evidence about what makes a good campaign, a successful or an unsuccessful political campaign. And it really has nothing to do with whether you think one candidate has a better public platform than another public platform. And I think that's a measure of success for teaching. So I am going to be very curious to hear what my two colleagues have to say on this subject as well.
Thank you.
Judy.
So as was announced, I'm in liberal studies and philosophy. And I speak from the point of view of being chair of liberal studies for 10 years and also the lead editor of the book that we use in our course called Introduction to Liberal Education, which is a book which is a class that about a quarter of our incoming students take. As chair of liberal studies, I would often get calls from parents concerned that their child was taking a class on liberal education and worried that they would become liberals in that process. So I always said, take the book out and look at it. We start with Socrates and Aristotle. We look at Paulo Freire. We look at, and we bring in contemporary thinkers, but all around holding that question about what is education, what's it for, what does it mean to be liberally educated in our culture. So, as I said, this is a fairly conservative area of the world. I was talking to two of my neighbors once and asked them, I'd been teaching classical liberal theory as just one part of a course I was teaching, which is a course of theory that our country was founded on. And I said to my neighbors, both of them had graduated from Christian colleges, and I said, well, before I tell you what my students think about what it means to be liberal, what do you think the word liberal means? And both of them agreed it meant immoral. So I said, okay, then I am the chair of immoral studies. So in liberal studies, we take seriously the definition of liberal education from the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is that it's an approach to learning that empowers individuals and prepares them to deal with complexity, diversity, and change. So liberal education helps students develop a sense of social responsibility, as well as strong transferable intellectual and practical skills. So that's at the base of what we bring when we're teaching our students. I can't really speak to the political orientation of our faculty. It's something that we don't really talk about very much. Certainly there's a continuum. Like Erika said, people are not one or the other. There's a wide range of most likely political views. We have 3 people in our faculty who are ordained ministers. I do think, though, according to the questions that our last speaker posed as the conservative questions, that probably all of our faculty probably do side on the side of liberalism, because we deal so much with social justice. That is the question that we talk about, social justice. We talk about we take seriously the Socratic exam in life, what it means to reflect about ourselves and our community. We want to endorse and consider a wide range of perspectives and a wide range of peoples and cultures using literature and philosophy. So we're reading stories, novels, literature, philosophic ideas that hold a lot of different points of view. And most of our students care a lot about environmental issues. We focus on community responsibility. We understand ourselves as creators of community, and we think about how we prepare for that. So some of these issues certainly are progressive issues, but they can be approached from a wide variety of topics. And I don't teach by lecture in my classes, I teach by questioning. So I don't often espouse a point of view other than helping students really read deeply into texts and have good dialogue with each other. So when I teach Introduction to Liberal Education, when we hold that idea of what it means to be liberally educated in our culture, I want students to think about the role of education with these great thinkers of the past. So, and I take seriously what Hutchins said in the first part of the 20th century, and he was at the University of Chicago. He said, the best education for the best of us is the best education for all of us. And I think that is holding these ideals of the best of education and how we can do that in a lot of different settings, because I take access very seriously too. So our courses teach ethical reasoning in terms of the general education requirements. That's something that we do in our class. And we encourage students to consider their values not like a brick that they're holding on to that's been passed from one generation to the other, but something that needs to be taken apart and put back together from their own perspective. So it needs to be analyzed. Recently, I've been teaching a course called Leadership for Social Change. I guess just the idea of leadership for social change is a progressive idea, I would think. Perhaps, I don't know. The conservatives also want to change culture, so we all want to move forward in terms of creating the best possible society. So I think of leadership as one way of expressing liberal education. And my colleagues are often surprised by that, because you think of leadership, you might think of business or government. But I think that leadership, when I talk about leadership, it's the idea of integrity. It's the idea of knowing yourself. It's being able to take a long perspective. It's figuring out your values in a work community as well as in your social community. And part of the reason that I talk about leadership is I think it's one way to talk about liberal education in a way that makes sense to the larger world. So I actually got to leadership studies in a roundabout way, trying to help students think about how they're going to articulate the values of liberal education to a larger world. And I have said for a long time, just in passing, that liberal education is an education for leadership, because it's an education for thinking well. So I'm trying to be specific about that and give students the language to articulate that in terms of the larger world. In my leadership course, we study figures like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Jane Addams, Cesar Chavez, and the students do have to do a project related to a social issue. The topic is their choice. I do not prescribe any topics to them. This semester, the topics that they chose were educational funding, LGBT education, poverty, and water. So these are social justice causes, not political causes, although certainly there are political aspects to all these causes. And like I said, I rarely talk about I never talk about Democrats and Republicans in the classroom. That is their choice. We're talking about who we are as educators and who we are as educated people. So I'm a pragmatist philosopher. And I identify with the ideas of John Dewey and Jane Addams. And for both of them, the role of education is both to conserve the past, to pass along the history and values to the next generation, but also to critically think about what is and create space for newness. And I think if either of these fail, then education isn't what it's supposed to be. There are both those things present. So passing on to the next generation, the ideas, the methods, the great books, the great ideas, it preserves culture in a way against the destruction of the new human beings who might not understand it and value it. As Hannah Arendt said, to preserve the world against the mortality of its creators. And that's one of the purposes of education. So teachers then must must protect and pass on what we value about the past. But as Arendt also said, that it's the educator's job to mediate between the old and the new. The very profession requires of him or her an extraordinary respect for the past. But it's also very much the rethinking, the creation of a space for emergence, a space for newness. And she said, education is the point where you decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. And I have that at the top of my senior seminar class syllabus as they're going out into the world. Do you love the world enough to accept responsibility for it? So John Dewey, who I suppose is the quintessential progressive thinker, at least that's how he was identified in the early 20th century as a different type of progressivism, also surprisingly perhaps talked about the conservative value of education. He says that continuity of any experience through the renewing of it in a social group is a literal fact. Education in its broadest sense is the means of this social continuity of life. So immature members need to be initiated into the interest, purposes, information, skills, and practices of the mature members. Otherwise, the group will cease its characteristic life. I did have some of my neighbors, when I told them I was doing my dissertation on John Dewey, said, he's the reason that education is in the mess that it is. And, oh dear. But as Dewey points out, the problem for most educators, particularly in a democracy, is that we must transmit not just ideas and methods to another generation, but also a creative way of being in the world that values both the ideas of the past, but critically examines them and encourages the new. Bringing together both the old and the new in a way that allows not only for maintenance, but for recreation, as he called it, the reweaving of the social fabric. So we have this inherent conflict between the conserving and preserving role of education and the progress that needs to be made in terms of change. How then do we encourage this forward-moving new ideas while maintaining and conserving the values of the old, which has allowed us to move to this point? And particularly in this era of big data, when any sort of factual data can be easily obtained at the click of a mouse, education as memorizing facts and assimilating data is pretty bankrupt. So we really are at the point of thinking about what then should we be doing. And I think for me it's about learning how to think and understanding those thinking skills. So in philosophical terms, liberal education has been seen as a good in and of itself. It serves its own end in the experience of living. And you know, as we heard yesterday from Eva, that education makes life richer. It makes life more interesting, which I also say to students. I've been known to say that you'll get the jokes in the movies if you get liberally educated. And I said once that if, how would you get the joke about the bodacious philosopher Socrates if you hadn't ever read Socrates, right? And that's in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and students don't get that joke anymore because it's a long ago movie. But Dewey said the main effects of education is the achieving of a life of rich significance. And that's the discussion that we have in our courses. And since life itself is a process of growth, education is not merely a preparation for life, but an essential part of life. We are creatures who must learn to learn, not only to survive, but also to be fully present in the world.
Thank you. Quincy.
Quincy Williams from the School of Public Nonprofit and Health Administration. I'm going to talk from the perspective of many of our students that struggle, in particular our minority students. And we're a country that is divided between the haves and the have-nots. And one of the biggest challenges that a lot of our students face from a faculty perspective is the lack of cultural awareness and cultural barriers. And so for many of our minority students, they really struggle with that. In particular, especially minority students that come from an urban school or from a school district where the academic rigor is not up to par or standard by the time they get to the college setting. So it's very challenging for them. And understanding the different ways and styles that students learn is another challenge that a lot of our faculty are struggling with. By trade, most, I'm not going to speak for all, but a majority of minority students, in particular African Americans and blacks, we have a tendency to learn by hands-on experience or practical learning. So, you know, to have them read a 600-page book and, you know, have them write this long rhetorical paper might not work necessarily for them to get the message across in the same way. So it's very challenging for students from that space. I'm a firm believer as educator, we must equip our students with values, skills, and knowledge. And it's part of our job as educators is to figure out the means of how we can translate that information for others who might not understand. When I think of higher education and academics, it's not always about having the highest ACT scores, not always having the highest SAT scores, not always having the highest GPA. Because quite honestly, I've seen students that are busting 31, 32, 33s on ACTs don't have the most common sense. Very educated from a book or contextual standpoint, but when it comes to common sense, it's not there. So as educators, how can we reach those students as well? So it's very challenging from that. Campus climate is very critical to all students and for the ability to learn from different cultures. I have the very distinct pleasure of not only being in the College of Community Public Service, but also working with liberal studies and teaching in a ITC course, which is an intercultural training certificate course, which is very helpful for a lot of students to be able to integrate and to learn about different cultures, whether it's from a religious standpoint, whether it's from an educational, academic, cultural standpoint. In particular, the running joke that I always had is who's been to the Indiana border? A lot of students, when I first got here 8 years ago, actually this week, a lot of students had never left West Michigan. And so they have this very small bubble of thinking, you know, you're pretty liberal. Now, I don't think so much I'm liberal. I've lived life outside of West Michigan. So it's a different way of thinking. And so students love to be challenged. And when you challenge students to think from a different perspective, I think it really enhances their educational ability. The one thing that I always encourage students, especially whether you're conservative or you're liberal, and I hate those terminology personally, I find it interesting for my conservative students, I always encourage them to look at MSNBC. And if you're considered liberal, look at Fox, because you know what? You want to be able to see what the other perspective, the other side is what their argument is. You might not agree philosophically or morally, but you need to understand where there's the other viewpoint. There's not a right, there's not a wrong. And it's just, how do you get there? Students use many methods and many different ways to get to the answer. There's not always that one right way. And that's one thing that we always try to stress. From a cultural standpoint, a lot of faculty, and I'm not just talking about Grand Valley, I'm talking about academia as a whole. I would say not everyone comes from the direct same background. So once again, going back to what I was talking about educating and getting students to buy in, to understand, it's very challenging. And a lot of times faculty have a tendency to have the roles reversed. And the way I look at it is that as faculty and as staff and as administrators, we are serving a customer base, and that customer base are our students. So we can no longer use that one method of trying to reach our students, of saying, hey, I'm the teacher, you're the students, let me talk to you, and you just regurgitate the information. It is a two-way street. I feel that as faculty and staff that we should be able to learn from the student as well as us teaching the students. And the way we utilize that is by listening to what the students' needs, what their wants, and what their backgrounds have encountered. Because there is an age difference in the way that we are able to ascertain our information. I have a tendency to use a lot of 80s and 90s terminology that my children, they look at me and like, Daddy, they don't use that terminology anymore. And it's the same way in higher education. back in the 70s and the 80s, there wasn't the internet. Information wasn't readily available for you to get that, versus a lot of practitioners and academics still have that same philosophy of going out and getting that information, but it's a whole different ballgame. So it's very challenging from that perspective. I love what you said, Dr. King, about not changing people's minds, and I'm a strong believer in that. As academics, we are not in the business of changing minds, but giving them options to choose from. And I think here at Grand Valley, we do a very good job of not forcing or expecting students to change their mind necessarily, but to give them different options, to let them know what's out there and available. I talked a little bit about the academic preparedness. Let me speak a little bit to my upbringing coming out of Kansas City, Missouri School District, which is currently an unaccredited school district. And it's an urban school district that a lot of us young black men, black students, or any minority students, any students in particular, come out. It's very challenging to make that adaptation to the college life. And the expectation is completely different. And as academics, we have to understand the challenges and the limitations that our students are coming into, and that we're not going to be able to put that round, what's the old saying, square peg, round hole, square peg, you know what we're talking about. And we really have to take that into consideration. And so that's kind of, I don't see the political side of things. I think of our college in particular. I think of our academic department in particular. I often get answered the question, why are we able to attract a lot of minority students to our major? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have a very diverse, a very eclectic faculty and staff. And I think our faculty, our staff, and our department is very optimistic and very open. And students are able to gauge and relate to individuals that are like that. I think it also helps with the fact that students are able, so in particular minority students, are able to see success of minorities, and they can see that as an attainable or achievable goal. One of the biggest challenges in higher education is that various disciplines never talk about the fact of the roles, the prominent roles, and the great things that minorities have paved the way in that field of study. And so students are very disheartened because it's never talked about. I spoke with a young student actually last week, and this person is a pre-nursing student, and one of the concerns that she had in particular was talking about she has yet to learn anything about the accomplishments that African Americans and the roles that they have played in our medical field. And so when we think about liberal arts and liberal education, I think it's important that we talk about everyone's role and and what they have brought to the table for our students, because that is what gets students energized, and that's what keeps them going, knowing that, there are other people who have come before me who have played this prominent role, and I want to carry on that tradition that has been set forth. And so that's kind of sort of my view and take when it comes to education, and not looking at it from really a political side of it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, my two colleagues. You all, as an audience, proved your incredible worth in terms of asking wonderful questions after our first speaker this morning. So we are now throwing it open to you for discussion purposes. We will be glad to respond to any comments or questions you might have.
Erika, could you please move your microphone?
Thank you. Technology. To repeat that, you were a wonderful audience this morning, asking very penetrating and thoughtful questions. We look forward to responding to some of them now.
I have a question about the matter of teachers sharing their political views, and I think there's a fair unanimity among you. But I've known professors and also school teachers who passionately believed that it was their duty to let their students know what they thought, that this was respectful, that they wanted an honest and open relationship, and that they were, in effect, wouldn't wish to deprive or hide. There's been a kind of hide-and-seek argument earlier in the previous panel, and you know, should one be open? Is it prudent to be open? Does one's openness stifle students, or does it in fact lead to an honest and relationship? So that's an argument I've heard, and I would like to hear your thoughts about that, because it isn't. It's you obviously, as a group, three of you have said you don't practice this kind of "I'll be honest with you" approach, but people believe in it, and it may come from a good place. I don't know.
I'll try the first go round and then see what my colleagues think about this. I firmly believe that academics should have the ability to make this determination for themselves and for their own classroom setting. So for example, perhaps in an introductory class, you might take a different route than you would, say, in an upper division seminar, a senior seminar, something along those lines. I believe in that kind of intellectual diversity in higher education that allows faculty members to make that determination about what works best for them. You know, I've made a particular decision. I think it has worked well for me, but I very much respect my colleagues who, and there are some who do talk about their own particular values, their own particular political perceptions on a certain issue. I think my reservation would be to, as a faculty member, contemplate doing this with a sense that I'm sharing my deep-seated feelings with you, but that I also, if yours disagree with my deep-seated perceptions, I will in fact respect yours as well. So I think that there's a caveat there. But I'm all in favor of allowing, and you know, I'm not the decider on any of these issues, but I think this is a debatable question in academia, and different faculty come up with very differing points of view and have very successful learning outcomes. So I just don't believe in the one model fits all approach.
Right. So I don't ever talk about what political party I might belong to. But given that the work that I do in my teaching, it's about students, it's not about me. So, you know, I certainly endorse being open with anybody that I know as a friend. But I think in terms of my relationship with students, it's not the same sort of thing. It's more, I need to be very respectful of their journey. So in terms of politics, no, I probably don't. Though I did say something in class after Arizona voted to allow discrimination of people that were LGBT in businesses. And my students actually started laughing. They said, "I can't believe you actually said that," because I've talked about not talking about politics. But in general, I don't. But on the other hand, I do talk about equity. And I do talk about social justice, and I do talk about race, and I do talk about gender issues. And all of those could be, under the definition that we saw in the last speaker, could be seen as liberal causes, I would think. I had a student write in an evaluation, "I think she might be a feminist." And that made me laugh, because I'm pretty clear that I'm a feminist in my classroom. That is not a secret. But he thought, I don't know, he or she thought she had found something out. So yes, I'm a feminist in my classroom. And I think that is an important stand to take about women's equality as an intellectual stand. But that doesn't mean that I think that they should. Now, I don't ever bring up the question of abortion, because my experience is that abortion is a question that people cannot think on both sides and still stay open to education. that if they disagreed with me and my point of view of education, it's almost as if education is over. I become the other, the enemy, there's no more education. So some issues are so politically fraught that students react to them. So some issues I just don't go there because I found that I'm going to lose half the students either way. So I don't go there. But in terms of our readings, in terms of our investigation of our culture, I don't see a problem with standing for issues of equity and how those play out. I mean, I think social justice is something students should have thought a lot about coming out of college.
I'll be honest, I bash both parties because it's entertainment to me when I look at that. You know, you're going to find good and bad about both political parties. So if we get into a topical discussion, I don't show them what side where I stand because I'll find the good and bad about both sides. And I try to play, you know, the perspective of, you know what, I'm not trying to indoctrinate you by any means by my political beliefs, but I will make fun of both parties because there's room to go around for all of them. We can spend a whole class period, a whole year talking about both parties because there's good and bad. So I try not to push my political beliefs. It's interesting, students, they peg me pretty quickly. They think I'm one way, but usually 9 times out of 10 they're wrong. But I try to keep away from it.
May I just add one more technology again here. One more thing. As somebody who studies the media, it's very interesting to note that in many other democracies, the ideal in the U.S. media, which some laugh at today, but it is still an ideal, of the concept of objectivity. Political objectivity is something that journalists continue in the 21st century, as they were in the 20th century, to be trained in this country that that is the ideal way of reporting social, political, and current events, and that the reporter is to adopt a neutral position. But in many Western democracies, European democracies, that notion of how the media should perform is not seen as an appropriate way to do it. And according to the kind of notion you brought up about telling, in this case, your readers or your viewers what your political viewpoint is, a lot of other media organizations are very pleased to do this in their straightforward reporting. So again, a differing kind of perspective. I think there is room for all of us. Now, as a student of the media, where I get distressed is where the differing perspectives in commentary start boiling down to talking heads screaming at each other back and forth without any kind of reflection. But I do think that there is a place for, if somebody chooses to do so, to present what your basic beliefs are. But I think there should be choice for individuals in the academy.
And certainly I don't ever grade based on whether students would agree with me or not. That seems pretty inappropriate, clearly inappropriate. I'd be interested in hearing from others of you what you think. You're mostly teachers. Yeah. Susan?
To follow your question, I teach a course for many years, and actually I developed a course called Scripture as Literature. So I do teach world scriptures, Christian texts, Jewish texts, and Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist. And I also teach world mythology. And my goal as a teacher, as a professor, is to ask the student to be able to read those texts and to appreciate, and also not just look at the positive or the negative. And I don't want to privilege any scriptures as a teacher. And so they are able to look all, like you say, all the options there. And at the end of the semester, I would share with the student my background, that I went to Christian University, my husband is Jewish, my parents practice both Confucianism and Taoism, and I have Mormon brothers and sister-in-laws. So, and my best friend in college is a Baha'i. So I want the student to know that this class is not a class to indoctrinate them into any particular religion or mythology. So it is all out there for them to choose. And they should be able to identify particular scripture has certain biases towards certain ideology. And so not all scriptures are perfect, right? And every scripture has flaw in it. And this is the purpose of this, the course. And I think as a professor, I agree with Erika that we should make that decision, and that decision when to share and when to withhold. But I would not share with my student what political party that I vote for. And that is something that I would not do, because this is nothing to do with the class. Thank you.
Hello. I personally do not believe that an institution should doctrinize students on a political front. However, because they are customer based, I believe, and I want to allude this question to Mr. Williams, that we need to be more concerned about students who are having academic rigor and challenges in their institution, and also have questions regarding some of the contributions that African Americans or any other minority who have made a contribution to this society should be made available. I also think that there needs to be a greater connection to secondary and primary education, because when there's no cultural competency and there's no real community in regards to all of the people that lives in the community surrounding education and the flaws, the systemic flaws that reside in our nation, that we address the right thing. Now, saying don't doctrinize students into the political front is not saying don't have conversations surrounding it, but I certainly believe that the institution is required to educate them and allow them to participate as well. I believe that success comes from allowing individuals to come up with the answers, the questions to some of the answers that, some of the questions that's put out by professors. I heard Dr. Brand say yesterday that she's a tutor even though she have a PhD. And she is a tutor because she allows students to think for themselves and to participate. And I know for a fact that African Americans are more hands-on. Practical application is the way that they learn. And I believe that if we are fair surrounding politics in regards to respecting each political party, that each individual will have their own way and path to finding what party that they belong in. But certainly I believe that the doctrinizing of students surrounding political views is something that we need to be really careful about, and we need to make sure that we're providing the services that each individual student are paying for. So that's my view.
This would be a general question. So I'm curious about a specific instance that can happen in a classroom, and it's one I have experienced. Thankfully, it doesn't have it often, but when a student makes a particularly offensive statement to another student, be it sexist, be it racist, homophobic, and what is your role as a leader of the classroom? So you talk about having an open dialogue, not in the business of changing minds, but what do you do in those situations where it might actually harm the dialogue? One student might not feel like they can participate, or they might not feel safe to contribute. So I know it's a specific instance, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on
that. In the intercultural competence training ITC 100 course, that actually happens more often than not. Especially the two topical areas that we really get heated, where literally one time I thought I was going to have to call security, is when we talk about religion and we talk about same-sex preference. Those are the two hot topic buttons. And we did have an instance, and one of the topical areas was when we were talking about, when I have students, they're required to learn about a different religion other than their own. And so depending on who I have in class, in particular I had 21 students in class, 19 students just happened to be white students. And so I really wanted to focus on a religion area that I knew that they knew very little about. And when they came back and they made their presentation, they made a reference to, no way I would ever be able to fit into this religion because they're not really Christian. They say they're Christian, which then sparks an argument on another side is, as a Christian, how can you say that? Which then the dialogue gets heated. And then you throw into the fact that in this particular class, I had 4 or 5 students that practice atheism. So then you have that third chime in, and it just became one big cluster of argument. So my role is to kind of sort of facilitate and just once again step back and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, I respect what you're saying, but also listen to the other person's perspective. Because there is no one right way to everything. Because if you've already been indoctrinated, ingrained through your upbringing, through your culture, or what have you, you have this one mindset already there. But you have to listen to the other people that are there with you to see where they're coming from. So it's going to happen at some point in time. It's about just being able to control the situation per se and making sure that people are able to hear other people's perspective. Now, whether they let it soak in like a sponge and take that knowledge and go with it, that's their choice. If they don't, so be it. But it's trying to at least let the other people have, other individuals have their say or speak their mind or their perspective on things.
So in most of my classes, we start out by creating ground rules for dialogue, and I'll put out a few of them and ask students to also write ground rules for dialogue. And the ground rules require that we be respectful, that any comments are directed not at a person but at ideas, and clearly ideas that are harmful to other people are just off limits. I mean, we need to create a space for thinking and not a space for attacking people. It actually doesn't happen very often in my classroom that students are saying things that are damaging to other people. At least it doesn't happen in the large dialogue that I'm facilitating. So if a student said something derogatory about women, about people from a different race, about different religions, different cultures, I take that person aside and we have a conversation. We actually start that conversation right in class. You know, that is unacceptable to do that. Now, if we're talking about a controversial text, a controversial book, and people express different ideas, certainly that is ideas supported by reasoning, ideas supported by good thinking, but not ideas that are harmful and damaging. It's just inappropriate, and I'm pretty clear with that in the beginning of class.
I think my response was beautifully expressed by both of my colleagues, but I thought I could just provide another example of something that startled me a little bit a couple of years ago. And for me, after all these years of teaching, to be startled is a bit unusual. But I had agreed to teach what we call at Grand Valley the senior capstone, which is a very ill-defined course that any professor can decide what to do with it, and it ends up being whatever the professor and the students wish to make of it. I decided to, it's interesting for this particular whole symposium, I'm now teaching multiple courses for the senior seminar in political science on contemporary American political ideology. So this whole symposium is of great interest to me. And one of the things, among many others, that I needed to think about are the readings, which is something we actually haven't talked about very much, but I think is, of course, absolutely extremely important and integral to the whole academic enterprise, because at least in theory, this is where a great deal of the students' knowledge is coming from. And of course, as we all know, not everybody reads every piece of everything that we assign. But one of the books that I assigned is, well, when I first assigned it, it was a brand new book written by two political scientists, one who self-identifies as again, as we've already discovered from our previous speakers, political scientists tend often to cluster more toward the middle of the simplistic political spectrum, as we've defined it, than other disciplines. But one of these political scientists defines himself as a little bit to the left of center. The other one defines himself, self-identifies as a little bit to the right of center. These two political scientists wrote a book in 2012 called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks." And some of you may be familiar with this. Mann and Hauenstein are the two political scientists. They are students of Congress. And I assigned this book in an American political ideology course because what they're looking at is what they term partisan dysfunction in American politics, specifically focusing in on the problems of Congress. And of course, this is something that has garnered not just the attention of these two individuals, but great media debate. Do we have a dysfunctional political system? And of course, as I say, the defeat of Eric Cantor has certainly propelled this discussion even further at the very moment. Most of the time, students look at this book and do what we've already discussed in class, which is to look at the argument that these two professors make, these two political scientists make, and evaluate the evidence that they present for their argument, that their conclusion, yes, we do have a dysfunctional Congress, and their argument furthermore is it's getting worse, hence the title, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. So they should be riding high right now because they can write the next addendum to this particular book. Most of the time, students very happily will get involved in a discussion and an analysis of where these academics are coming from, what kind of evidence they've looked at, and it's partly historical evidence, it's partly interviews with members of Congress, and then it's partly also analysis of voting records in Congress. I had one student who told me, fortunately, he didn't do this in class, but he said, I picked up this book, read 3 pages, and I threw it across the room, never to look at it again. My hope was that he hadn't wrecked it, so when he went back to get his refund, that he could get a better refund. And he told me, he said, I could tell it was an anti-conservative diatribe. And I said to him, actually in front of the class, because he made this announcement to all, I said, but do you understand that the purpose of having you read this is not to force you to agree or disagree with what these authors are saying, but to understand the argument they're making and then to be able to respond with evaluation of the kind of evidence that they're presenting. And if you believe that their evidence is inadequate, discuss why and present that kind of an argument. And I just thought it was unfortunate that he was closing himself off to having a discussion. Fortunately, the rest of the class was willing to have the discussion.
About a week, or last week, sometime somebody told me about a friend of theirs who chose to go to Hope College rather than Grand Valley because she said Grand Valley was too liberal. And I just thought, Hope is not all that conservative. Some parts of it are, but and I just thought that's just so unfortunate that somebody would be afraid of exposing themselves to ideas that they might not be able to think about, to entertain these ideas and still maintain their own ideas or come to their own conclusions from those ideas. So yeah, I think that we do need to, like you said, watch the other news, listen to the other viewpoints, and that's something that is part of a liberal education, to hold various ideas and think about them and create them, and create our own perspectives on them. But in terms of your question too, the times that I've had problems with it has been on online discussion. It does seem like students, if they're not face-to-face with students, sometimes are more willing to say harmful things. When I used to teach them.
Hence media blogs.
I know. Some of those media blogs are just awful. But when I taught in Muskegon, and I taught there for a couple of years and really enjoyed that, but we were talking about the issues facing Muskegon at that time, and Muskegon is a city that's really struggling economically, and the race issues there are pretty pitted. And so one student said she wouldn't go to this side of town because it would be dangerous when they were talking. And another student accused that student of being a racist, and the dialogue just went like that. And I had to intervene and say, stop. And then in class, take each student aside and have a conversation and then address it as a whole class. So, yeah, it's those ground rules again. Yeah, it does happen. And it happens around these contested issues. But there's something about our culture, those blogs and those responses to news articles that makes us think it's okay to just throw things out there, but certainly not in education. That's not okay. What do you all think? I'm interested.
I hear a couple more.
So a follow-up, I think about a follow-up to both of yours questions. Okay, the boy who's a conservative who doesn't want to read a liberal book, and in your case, the girl who chooses Hope College because she feels it's more conservative, and both of you kind of have dismissed that idea of conservatism as kind of ridiculous. In the case of the boy, did you or your class consider at all that possibly you could say to him, if you read this liberal book, what conservative book is the counter side that everyone else can look at and look at that? The girl who went to Hope, did she feel safe? I know my youngest daughter felt that at Michigan State, even though she sees herself as a conservative, she said, Mom, you don't know the peer pressure that I feel. So I just am quiet and kind of follow along. And she's not a quiet kid, but sometimes a liberal pressure for a conservative. I mean, are you looking at the other side?
Let me just, because I'm the one who brought up the particular book issue, one of the things that I should have mentioned that I neglected to mention, so thank you for bringing this up, is that when I looked at selecting different kinds of readings, I very much looked to get a mixture of different political perspectives. So just as an example, I found a very well-documented, well-written essay by a man named Michael Gerson, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, so he writes beautifully. He now is a columnist for the Washington Post, and he writes very thoughtful, what I would call, or what today would be labeled, establishment conservative perspective. So that was one of the things I chose. And we had a discussion about, here's a conservative writing about conservatism. But he was also worried about some of the what he considered. Now, here again, we're looking at different ways of viewing reality and our worldview. But his worldview was that some of the trends in the Republican Party, he thought, were moving too far away from what he saw as sort of a lot of conservative basics. Another person I chose to use was the writings, and I think these also very much espouse nicely a conservative viewpoint on national security and international affairs, Charles Krauthammer, whom some of you may know as a commentator both on Fox News, but he also writes a column for the Washington Post. But again, using his own ideas about what is the appropriate role of the United States in the international sector. So yes, I did in fact do this, which is why I was disappointed about the person having that reaction to one of the readings, because I had tried very much to balance these perspectives throughout the semester. And I think that's very important. And then to have, as I say, a discussion that looks at, do a careful analysis of the text, look at the words, the phraseology of these individuals, what kind of perspective from both the liberal, conservative, libertarian. I think here again we've got differing perspectives, so I found libertarian writers as well. As many different contemporary perspectives as I could get, and then to have the students analyze them, not necessarily that they believed them all, but to have that opportunity, because this is one of the things I think so important with education. And this is what worries me about the conservative criticism of the academy, is that there isn't that exposure to all of these different possible ideas. And so what I tried to do was to make sure that happened, and then to be able to have a discussion about what these approaches mean, and students then can draw their own conclusions at the end.
And it is true. I mean, I've been reading research about retention in college, and this is particularly a class-based, economic class-based discussion, that students stay in college if they feel like this is a place for someone like me, if they feel at home and comfortable, and that is, there's lots of evidence about if you don't feel that you're at home there, that this is a place for someone like me, you don't stay. So that is certainly an issue, that somebody would go to Hope because they knew they would feel more at home there and feel more comfortable there. But yet it is kind of just a sad thing that we separate ourselves from others in this way. That we go to different TV stations if you're religious, if you're conservative or liberal, or you go to different colleges, so that is an issue, that we're not listening to multiple sides. I don't think that Grand Valley is remarkably liberal. I don't have that experience of Grand Valley. And I don't know about this student. I didn't know her personally. It was somebody talking about a friend of hers. If you're a person who doesn't believe, for example, in evolution, it would be hard to find a college biology department, I would think, an academic biology department that's going to endorse your perspective, that you're going to really have to listen to other perspectives and hold on to it. A recent study by the by Gallup last week, still 20-some% of people who are college educated don't believe in evolution. They believe that humans were created 10,000 years ago without any intervention from evolution in those 10,000 years. So people do still hold on to their ideas, even though, again, I would find it hard to find biology departments who would teach that perspective. But I agree. Especially when you're going off to a new environment, to go to some place where you know that you'll feel comfortable, more comfortable, it's a fair choice. I'm not necessarily criticizing that, but just some regret at the polarization of our ability to listen to each other. Eva?
There's a question here.
Sorry, I didn't know if there's one back here.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we were waiting for this one.
Okay.
Sorry.
I hope I can speak clearly enough. I've got Parkinson's and I've got disorder. So please be a little bit. I taught 44 years here at Grand Valley. And as a faculty member, when I was on campus, I felt like a conservative. Drove off campus, felt like a flaming liberal. 2, I taught evolution, and I also taught global warming. As I taught environmental courses, and I also taught evolution, so I know a little bit about having the gold standard, as we call it, in science as to what counts as evidence for and against. And that leaves out a lot of what people like to talk about as religion. We even talk about the evolution of morality, by the way, today in terms of evolutionary theory. And that's important to keep in mind. What I'm interested in is the extent to which our current liberal arts or liberal education section that you represent deal with some of these issues in terms of critical thinking, because it's really important. What counts as evidence?
Yes, we certainly do talk about that. What counts as evidence? What counts as rational thinking? How well can you think about it, understanding various perspectives and coming to your own conclusion based on logical analysis? We are not a science-based program, so we don't talk about science in that way, but we certainly do look at multiple perspectives and look at that in terms of philosophical understanding, if this is a logical argument.
Well, we do have the gold standard in science. We also have a phrase to keep in mind. The authority of a scientist is measured by how long they can delay progress in their field.
How long they can what?
The authority of a scientist is measured by how long they can delay progress in their field.
Nice, good point.
In the discipline of political science, I think, as I mentioned, we have become more evidence-driven, and the evidence is acquired through some form of observation, testing, measurement, close historical analysis of texts. Unlike the science, and so we, in that sense, I think, adhere to some form of the scientific method, but there's no one agreed upon specific methodology that gets to the best evidence. So what we talk about a lot in the methodologies of social scientists, and we've got a couple of social science methodologists who were speaking last night and this morning, is to look at multiple methods, different ways of collecting evidence, and then evaluating it. So it takes a whole semester to analyze this, but we certainly do attempt to use different ways of testing and measurement. But unfortunately, I just can't go into them at this point without putting everybody totally to sleep.
And we look at, like we look at literature, you want to be able to put yourself into other people's perspectives and understand other perspectives. If we're looking at religion, we might be thinking about what is the religious experience that person is having, and trying to understand others in that way. It's not the same kind of evidence, but it is a type of evidence. Did you have something?
I just wanted to reiterate that from a cultural competence standpoint, that we have to take into consideration and account the person's individual upbringing. So that plays a major barrier on their philosophy and the way they view the world. So, and parents play a major role. If students come from a quote-unquote conservative household, they're probably more likely to think from a conservative standpoint versus a liberal. So we have to take into account everyone's situation and to be open and not just think one-sided or have linear thinking.
I think, Eva, did you have a question?
This is a really difficult question for me, so presumably for you too. Is the ability to respect the other side not really based on the notion that no one ought to believe with real ardor in the truth of their own position? Shall I rephrase it, or have I said it clearly? In order to have respect for an alternative opinion, mustn't one believe that no one ought to believe in their own truth?
Steve.
So,
Excuse me. Mr. Williams said twice that there's no right way and no wrong way. You did say that.
Right.
That's what made me ask the question.
Interesting enough, I'll do a quick short story. I think it was 2, maybe 3 years ago. in my ITC course in particular, a young lady had pegged herself to be this ultra-conservative. She's like, I'm far right, I'm this conservative. By the end of class, she was far from anything what I quote identify as a conservative, because she was very liberal on a lot of social issues. And so to answer your question, I think the challenging part is for students to be able just to even think about considering other people's thoughts and notions, which is hard enough. Because if you've been trained one way and then all of a sudden you have to adapt, it's tough. Let me use this analogy because I'm a sports geek. If you have had this certain batting stance in baseball your entire life, and then all of a sudden you get to college and then someone tells you, you know what, it's wrong. You have to alter it. You have to look at it differently. You have to do it differently. It's the same concept as the way I look at it, is that you have to look at what you can look, how can you look at it differently from that perspective.
Nice analogy.
I think my voice will carry. After 9/11, I said to myself, I must be very careful not to hold strong beliefs, because it was very scary that people drove into or flew into buildings with the belief, and it was like, it was hard to believe. So I attempt to empty my brain, and I am a woman of strong opinions.
And yet, most people had the opposite response to 9/11. I think most people adopted a fear-based, and became more polarized. But yeah.
It's the same question.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. I would actually like to continue in the vein of those same two questions. My name is Patrice Rankin, and I'm the Dean for Arts and Humanities at Hope College. So when I hear about why a student might choose Hope over other places, my immediate response isn't necessarily because that student is conservative. We have a 1 to 10 faculty-student ratio. Care of the self is very important at Hope, and spiritual formation of students are also points that are very important to students at Hope College. I was a professor at Purdue University prior to coming to Hope, and it was a place where substance abuse was rampant. We don't have that as much at Hope College. The statistics are there to prove that. So I just want to maybe call for diligence, as the last two speakers have done, in how we sort of frame the questions and frame the arguments, and call for doubt in our own positions. In the end, I also want to push this question of conservative versus liberal, because we're throwing around these terms, and it's clear from the morning speaker that how we're each defining it, even though we think we know because of the political parties of Republican and Democrat, it's fairly clear that we're each talking at some level about something a little bit different.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that the terms are really useless, the liberal, conservative. And I only said that about Hope because that's what the student said. And that's what she articulated as the reason she chose to go do that. As I said, I don't think of Hope necessarily as a polar on a pole way over there. Then, I don't see those big differences. But certainly, I have many conservative students in my classes, and many liberal students, and we engage in great dialogue, and that is really important that we do that.
I would like to rephrase my question. Here's the question. Thank you. Can we find a way to be respectful of the opposition that allows for real conviction on our part? In other words, that we truly think we're on the right way, as one ought to. If you have an opinion, you ought to hold it that way. And yet, in spite of the fact that that means you ought to think the other party is wrong, we have to have respect for it. Is there a way to do that?
I think so, and I hope so. I mean, And how, but when the only limits I would put on there, as long as you're respectful of the person. And
That's one answer, that respect the fact that this person,
right.
that person wants you to respond to their opinion.
But I think a lot of it has to weigh, how is it delivered? Because if it's delivered in a meaningful context and it's not a lot of yelling and screaming and becoming polarizing, I think people will be respectful of that. It's the one thing that I always encourage is, you know what, have that open dialogue. You might not agree, and there's times where you agree to disagree, but at least have enough respect for that individual to understand their debate or their argument.
So civility is enough.
Civility is huge.
Right.
But I also, as somebody who majored in anthropology 1,000 years ago, I remember the notion very much of cultural relativism, which is both an empirical but also a philosophical issue, and that is, are all belief systems equal in this wonderful world? Or is there some higher standard for some belief systems versus another? I have never found an adequate answer to that philosophical question, but I think at sort of a root, you're getting at that particular issue, and I think it's a very, very important one that some of us who engage in empirical work often never quite get to that next level of interpretation and analysis. So I'm avoiding the answer, but I understand the importance of the question.
And can you have firmly held beliefs that are in opposition to the facts? So people might have a firmly held belief about people who are Islamic. And really, you know, and I'm going to hold to that belief when it's not true, if you look at the actual religion.
Evidence.
And so, again, that's that question of evidence.
That fact is also an artifact. And to say that something is not in accordance with the fact is also a construction.
Yeah. Can you say more about that?
Sure, give her the microphone.
What I mean is that the facts that are produced within a system which is asking the question.
The social construction of reality.
That's true. Yeah.
There's something in that.
Yeah, it's a good point, yeah.
And I'd like to say one more thing. I am curious myself in dialogue that is the only term, and this is my own creation, so it's nowhere, but it's benign conversation, where the dialogue is enhanced by the conversation to help me understand where someone is coming from their perception. And I find it really challenging not to, if I could say it in such a blatant way, take my yoga mat and bop them on the head. So that I can understand, because I go, how can somebody believe that way? But I really am curious. So if you have any ideas, I'm open.
But I think that notion of intellectual curiosity, maybe as a concluding statement, in my mind lies at the heart of a liberal arts education.
I see people nodding their heads. That is a great line to end on. I want to thank my colleagues here at Grand Valley State University, Professors King, Whips, and Williams. Thank you so much. Well, we will reconvene. Tori, we are going to reconvene at what, 1:45 in this room? And that'll be for our next panel discussion. So please come back, and for those of you who've already signed up for the lunch, we will go just down the hall here to the Meyer Regency Room, and we look forward to hosting you there, where we will have a very special presentation by our wonderful tutor here, Eva Brand. Thank you so much.